Her eyes snapped back to the excavation in front of her. The blade she'd been examining sat exactly where it had been, but now she could see what the falling dirt had exposed. More obsidian. Another blade, this one at a different angle, its tip pointing toward her knees. And another beyond that. "Don't move." Marco's voice came from above, tight with something between excitement and panic. "Dr. Ruiz, don't move. There are more underneath you." She became very aware of the pressure against her kneecaps. The ground beneath her felt different suddenly. Not solid. There was a give to it that hadn't been there before, or that she hadn't noticed. Like the earth under her weight was settling onto something hollow. Something that had been waiting in the dark for 5 centuries for someone to kneel in exactly the wrong spot. She didn't breathe, didn't shift her weight, just stayed frozen while her mind counted the blade tips she could now see in the disturbed soil. 4, 5, 6 visible obsidian points arranged in a pattern that followed a curve. A spiral, maybe. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Elena's pulse hammered in her sliced thumb, where she'd grabbed the pit wall to steady herself. The cut from her collarbone had already stopped bleeding, but this new one kept time with her heartbeat. A tiny throb of pain every second that reminded her she was kneeling over something that could rewrite everything they thought they knew about Aztec ritual practices. The morning sun had started to reach down into the excavation pit, turning the darkness from black to gray, and in that new light she could see the spiral pattern more clearly. Not random placement, deliberate arrangement. 13 obsidian blade tips pointing outward from a center point she couldn't see yet. Marco's camera shutter started clicking above her. 17 rapid shots in maybe 10 seconds, the sound oddly loud in the confined space of the pit. Professional documentation. Good. Whatever happened next, they'd have a record of this moment, of the cache exactly as they'd found it. She wanted to tell him to stop, to be quiet, to let her think, but another part of her brain knew he was doing exactly what he should be doing. This was the kind of discovery that only happened once in a career if you were lucky. She shifted her weight by fractions of inches, testing the ground beneath her knees. The hollow feeling was still there. Not imagination. Something about the soil structure under her was different from the packed clay everywhere else in this level. Looser, maybe. Or disturbed at some point, and then settled again. She'd been trained to recognize these differences, to read soil like other people read books, but usually she did it standing up with proper tools and measurements. Not frozen in place, afraid to move. Her hands were filthy, caked with the red-brown clay that dominated this stratum. The cut on her thumb had smeared blood across her palm, mixing with sweat and dirt until she looked like she'd been doing exactly what the Aztec priests had done with these blades 500 years ago. The thought made her stomach twist. She wiped her hand on her cargo pants, then reached for her brush, the soft bristled one she used for delicate work. The choice she made in the next 30 seconds would determine how this discovery was handled. By the book would mean stopping everything, calling in her site supervisor, Dr. Vasquez, getting the proper team down here with the right equipment and documentation protocols. That was the smart play, the career-safe play. But Vasquez was dealing with the museum board this morning, trying to justify why they should fund another season of excavation when the last 3 months had turned up mostly pottery fragments and a few unremarkable walls. This cache would justify a decade of funding. Maybe more. Elena reached down instead of up, started brushing away dirt with fingers that were bleeding and shaking and completely unprofessional. The soft clay came away easily, revealing more of the first blade. The handle emerged inch by inch, and what she saw made her breath catch. The grip was wrapped in fabric. Cotton. Had to be cotton based on the weave she could see. And it was still red. Not faded red. Not the pale ghost of color that sometimes survived in protected environments. Rich, deep red like it had been dyed last year. Cochineal, probably. The Aztecs had made that color from insects. crushing thousands of them to produce a red so vivid it had eventually become one of Mexico's major exports to Europe. But cochineal dye faded. It broke down under exposure to light and air and time. This shouldn't look this good after 5 centuries. Her mind raced through possibilities. Exceptional preservation, sealed environment, some chemical property of the surrounding soil that prevented normal degradation. All possible, all unlikely. The cotton itself should have rotted away completely. Organic materials didn't last like this unless conditions were absolutely perfect, and Mexico City's soil conditions were anything but perfect for preservation. She cleared around a second blade, same red cotton wrapping, same impossible preservation. Her training screamed at her to stop, to document, to proceed with proper protocol. But her hands kept working, kept brushing away clay, kept exposing more of the cache. Some distant part of her brain recognized this as obsession, as the kind of behavior that got archaeologists fired, or worse. She didn't care.
Log entry, day 47. We're deep beneath Mexico City, deeper than anyone has ever dug. The air is thick, tastes of damp earth and something else, something ancient. I've just unearthed an obsidian blade. It's unlike anything I've seen. The carvings are pre-Aztec, but the blade, it doesn't reflect my headlamp. It just swallows the light. There's residue. Marco, run a preliminary analysis. It looks like no, it can't be. It's fresh. My heart is pounding. This thing feels wrong, humming with a cold energy that makes my skin crawl. What is this place, Marco? Marco, are you up there? The silence down here is absolute, except for the dripping water and the frantic beating of my own heart. I have a terrible feeling I'm not alone anymore. Subscribe for more. Shu brushed at her neck automatically, irritated. Her fingers came away red. For a second, her brain refused to process it. Then the sting registered. Sharp, clean pain along her collarbone. She looked down and saw a thin line of blood welling up where something had sliced her skin. Not deep, barely more than a paper cut, but enough to produce that bright red that meant fresh blood, oxygenated blood, blood that hadn't been buried for 500 years. The third blade came clear. Then the fourth. Each one perfectly preserved, each one wrapped in that vivid red cotton. The spiral pattern became more obvious. They radiated out from a center point like spokes on a wheel, each blade angled slightly different from its neighbors. 9 blades visible now. Her knees ached from holding position, from not shifting her weight. The cut on her thumb had stopped throbbing, probably going numb. Above her, she heard boots on gravel. Heavy footsteps. Dr. Vasquez's voice carried down from the pit edge. The museum board is here. Early. Elena's stomach dropped. She looked up, dirt on her face, blood on her hands. Kneeling over an undocumented cache that could be the most significant find at Templo in 20 years. Marco stood at the ladder's top, camera in hand, looking between her and the direction of Vasquez's voice. His expression asked a clear question. What do we do? She made a choice. Tell him we're documenting pottery in grid 8. Standard fragments. Nothing unusual. Marco's eyes went wide. Dr. Ruiz, I can't 5 minutes. That's all I need. Then, we'll bring him down and show him properly. It was a lie. She needed an hour minimum to properly clear this cache. But 5 minutes would let her see what was at the center of the spiral. Would let her understand what this offering was actually for. Marco hesitated, then nodded and disappeared from view. She heard him calling out to Vasquez, voice carefully casual, redirecting him toward the equipment tent. Elena worked faster. The 10th blade emerged, then the 11th. Her brush hit something different at the center of the spiral. Not obsidian. Harder, smoother. She cleared around it with her fingers. No time for proper tools. Green stone. Jade, almost certainly. The Aztecs had valued jade more than gold, had used it for their most important ritual objects. The 12th blade. The 13th. The spiral was complete. Now, all 13 blades pointing outward from the jade piece at the center. Shu worked, the stone free from the clay, lifting it carefully. It was a bead, about the size of her thumbnail, carved with incredible precision. The surface showed a date glyph, the kind the Aztecs used to mark significant events in their calendar system. Except this wasn't an Aztec glyph, The style was wrong, older. This was Toltec carving. From a civilization that had collapsed 300 years before the Aztecs built Templo. Her mind struggled to process what that meant. The Aztecs had revered the Toltecs, had incorporated their mythology and symbols into their own culture. Finding Toltec artifacts at an Aztec site wasn't impossible, but finding them, as part of a foundation offering, buried at the construction level of the temple, suggested something completely different. This wasn't a burial cache. This was a foundation offering for a structure that, according to every historical record and archaeological survey they had, was never built at this location. She heard voices above. Vasquez was coming. She had maybe 30 seconds. She turned, the jade bead in her fingers, reading the date glyph more carefully. Then her blood went cold. The timestamp on Marco's camera for the first photograph he'd taken was 7:19. She'd counted the blade tips visible in that frame earlier. 14. She'd excavated 13 blades. There was a 14th one somewhere in this cache, and she hadn't seen it yet. Her eyes swept the spiral pattern again. All 13 positions accounted for. Nothing missing from the arrangement. But Marco's photograph didn't lie. At 7:19 this morning, there had been 14 obsidian blade tips visible in the disturbed soil, which meant either she'd miscounted in the stress of the moment, or one of the blades had moved. Obsidian blades didn't move on their own, not after 500 years in the ground. But her camera was time-stamped. Marco's was time-stamped. The evidence said 14. The cache in front of her said 13. And Dr. Vasquez's footsteps were getting closer, his voice now audible, giving instructions to someone about proper board presentation protocols. Elena slipped the jade bead into her pocket. Pure instinct. Bad instinct. The kind that ended careers. But something about this discovery felt wrong now. Felt like it needed protection from scrutiny until she understood what she was actually looking at. She grabbed her trowel, started smoothing clay back over the outer blades, making the spiral less obvious. Vasquez's voice came from directly above Marco, said you found pottery. She looked up, squinting against the morning sun behind his silhouette. Her site supervisor, her mentor for the last 8 years. The man who defought the university administration for funding when everyone else thought Templo had been excavated to exhaustion. His expression was tense, probably worried about the board. She opened her mouth to tell him about the cache. To do this right, where did you put the other one? The words came out before she could stop them. Not what she'd meant to say. Not even close. But her brain had connected something. Some pattern she couldn't quite articulate yet. The 14th blade. The too perfect preservation. Mr. Toltec bead, in an Aztec foundation offering. Vasquez's face went very still. What other one? And that S, when Elena realized the cotton wrappings on the blades were unread from 500-year-old cochineal dye. They were dark from recent moisture, from being buried in clay that hadn't had time to fully dry. Someone had disturbed this soil. Not 5 centuries ago, within the last month. The laboratory tent smelled like plastic and disinfectant. Elena sat alone at the work table at 2:34 in the afternoon, staring at the 14th blade she'd dug out without witnesses 3 hours ago. The obsidian sat on white archival paper under the LED examination lamp, and for the first time since she'd found it, she could see her own reflection in its surface. She looked exhausted, hollow, exactly like Dr. Patricia Mendoza had looked in the photographs from the Oaxaca investigation 6 years ago. Right before the academic review board stripped her credentials for falsifying a tomb discovery, Elena had been at that hearing, had sat in the gallery with the other young archaeologists, watching her former mentor's career disintegrate in real time. Mendoza had found genuine artifacts, combined them with pieces from different contexts, and created a narrative that supported her life's work on Zapotec burial practices. The fabrication had been brilliant. Would have held up except for one graduate student who'd noticed inconsistencies in the soil chemistry reports. By the time the investigation finished, 3 major papers had been retracted, and Mendoza was working at a community college, teaching introductory anthropology. The cut on Elena's thumb throbbed. She'd cleaned it, put a bandage on it, but every time her heart beat she felt it. A reminder. Don't become Mendoza. Don't let ambition override integrity. Don't cross the line. But she'd already crossed it. The jade bead sat in her pocket, unreported. The 14th blade sat on her examination table, excavated in secret. And she still hadn't told Vasquez about any of it. The museum board had left at noon without seeing the cache. Vasquez had shown them pottery instead, the standard fragments from Grid 7. Nothing special, but enough to suggest the site still had potential. He'd bought them another 3 months of funding, contingent on finding something significant. Something that would prove Templo Mayor's expansion pattern followed trade routes to Toltec territories. Routes, which was exactly what the jade bead would prove. If it was real, Elena picked up the 14th blade carefully, holding it by the edges. The napping technique was different from the other 13, subtly different, the kind of thing only someone with her training would notice. The percussion bulbs where the napper had struck the obsidian core were shallower. The edge showed micro-serrations that suggested steel tools, not stone. And the cotton wrapping, when she examined it under magnification, showed synthetic fibers mixed with the natural ones. This blade was maybe 50 years old, possibly younger. Her hands started shaking again. Not from excitement this time. From the slow, sick realization of what she was looking at. Someone had planted this cache, had arranged 13 authentic Aztec ritual knives around one Toltec jade bead, and added a modern forgery to complete the pattern. The question was who, and more importantly, when. She pulled out her field notebook, started going through the excavation timeline. Grid 8 had been opened 4 months ago. The first month had been standard work, clearing overburden, documenting the stratigraphy, nothing unusual. But 2 months ago, there'd been a week where she'd been in California presenting at a conference. Vasquez had supervised the site alone. The notes from that week were sparse, just basic measurements and a few photographs of wall fragments. Her stomach twisted. She didn't want to think what she was thinking. Vasquez had been her mentor, her advocate, the reason she'd got in this position in the first place. But she pulled up the site's security footage on her laptop anyway, entering her supervisor credentials to access the archived files. The footage was grainy, black and white, motion-activated cameras that covered the excavation perimeter. She scrolled back 2 months, found the week she'd been gone. Most of the recordings were daytime, showing the graduate students working. Vasquez moving between grids with his clipboard. Normal site activity. But there were also night recordings. 3 of them, all showing Vasquez entering the excavation area after midnight, carrying equipment bags, staying for 2 to 3 hours. Night work wasn't unusual. Sometimes you needed to do things when the city noise died down, when the light was better for certain kinds of photography. But protocol required logging all site visits. She checked the official records. Nothing. No entries for those 3 nights. The tent flap opened. Elena jumped, closed the laptop. Marco stepped in, his camera bag slung over one shoulder. He looked at the blade on the table, then at her face. You found another one. Not a question. She should lie. Should protect him from what she was learning. Instead, she nodded. Marco set his camera bag down, pulled up a stool. He had dirt under his fingernails, dust in his hair. 23 years old, finishing his master's degree, his whole career ahead of him. Dr. Ruiz, something's wrong with this cache. I've been going through the photos I took this morning, analyzing the soil structure. That clay was disturbed within the last 6 weeks, maybe less. Smart kid. Too smart to lie to. I know. So what do we do? Elena picked up the 14th blade, turned it so the light caught the edge. This one's modern. Look at the napping pattern. Steel tools.
Elena's fingers traced the sharp edge of the obsidian blade. It was too perfect. Beside it, a single jade bead gleamed under the lamplight. It couldn't be. Then, Marco slid a photo across the table. It was from an excavation years ago. And there was Dr. Vasquez, a familiar jade bead dangling from his neck. A chill went down Elena's spine. He'd planted them. He faked the discovery. Just then, her phone buzzed. A text from Vasquez. Let's meet tomorrow. Her career, her reputation. Everything was on the line. But the truth was more important. Taking a deep breath, she decided she would document everything: the blade, the bead, the photograph, and report him to the Federal Archaeology Commission. The path ahead would be difficult, but as she stood there, a sense of calm washed over her. She was ready. Science deserved the truth. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.
J. The jade bead sat on the white paper, green and ancient and real. Proof that somewhere in this mess of deception was genuine discovery. She just had to survive long enough to find it. The excavation pit looked different at 11:47 at night. Elena's headlamp carved a cone of white light through darkness that seemed thicker than it should be, heavier somehow, like the weight of 500 years pressing down from above. Marco stood beside her with the UV light and the soil sampling kit, both of them moving quietly even though there was nobody around to hear them. Security cameras had been disabled an hour ago, made to look like a power fluctuation. If anyone checked the logs tomorrow, they'd see a gap from 11:15 to midnight. Just long enough. She'd thought about this moment all evening through. Vasquez's meeting where he'd outlined the significance of the cash find, through dinner, alone in her apartment, where she'd barely touched her food through the long wait, until the city noise died down enough that they could slip back onto the site without attracting attention. Every step of this plan went against her training, against every protocol she'd ever followed. But protocols assumed honest colleagues. They assumed the system worked. So, what they didn't account for was what you did when your mentor was the one breaking the rules. Marco switched on the UV light. The beam swept across the cache, and Elena's breath stopped. 3 of the obsidian blade handles lit up fluorescent blue. Modern adhesive, the kind used in museum conservation, designed to be reversible and archival, but containing compounds that fluoresced under ultraviolet. Someone had reattached the cotton wrappings to the blades, using contemporary materials. Not 500 years ago. Within the last few months. 3 out of 13, Marco whispered, photographing each glowing handle. The rest might be original wrappings. Elena knelt at the pit edge, careful to avoid the same spot where she'd knelt that morning. The ground there still showed the depression from her knees, a reminder of how close she'd come to destroying evidence through carelessness. This time, she worked from the side, using proper tools, documenting every step. These soil samples would tell the real story. Clay that had been undisturbed for 5 centuries had a specific structure, a particular compaction and chemistry. Soil that had been dug up and replaced within weeks would show completely different characteristics. She worked the first sample tube into the earth, just outside the spiral pattern. The clay resisted, then gave way with that distinctive feel of long-settled soil. Good, that was the control sample. The baseline that would prove what undisturbed stratigraphy felt like at this depth. She capped the tube, labeled it with the grid coordinates and time stamp, handed it to Marco, who sealed it in an evidence bag. D. The second sample came from directly beneath where the jade bead had been buried. The tube went in easier. Much easier. The clay here was looser, aerated, recently disturbed. Elena's stomach sank even as part of her felt vindicated. This was the proof they needed. Incontrovertible evidence that someone had excavated this exact spot within the last 2 months and then carefully filled it back in. Marco was going through his tablet, pulling up files. I found his field notebook from the Tula excavation. The one from 4 years ago. Look at this entry. He angled the screen so Elena could see. Vasquez's handwriting, neat and precise, documenting the discovery of a jade bead with Toltec date glyphs, grid, location, depth, surrounding artifacts. All proper procedure. But at the bottom of the page, a note, significance unclear. Bead alone, insufficient evidence for trade route theory, requires additional context. Additional context. Like 13 obsidian ritual blades arranged in a spiral pattern around it. Lena sat back on her heels. The picture was becoming clearer. Vasquez T started with the intention to commit fraud. He'd found a genuine artifact that supported his theory, but the context wasn't strong enough to publish. So he'd held on to it, waited, and over the years as he'd worked other sites, he'd collected more pieces, authentic pieces, all legitimately excavated from their original locations. But instead of publishing them honestly with their real provenances, he'd been stockpiling them, waiting for the right moment to combine them into something more significant than the sum of their parts. This season at Templo was that moment. The university was cutting funding. His position was under review. At 63, he was facing retirement without the legacy-defining discovery he'd spent for decades chasing. So he'd taken his collection of authentic artifacts and created a context for them, a foundation offering that would prove everything he'd theorized about Toltec Aztec connections. It was desperation, not malice. That somehow made it worse. We need to find his storage location, Elena said, standing up, wherever he kept the artifacts before planting them. There'll be documentation, photographs from the original discoveries. That's what we need to salvage the real science from this mess. Marco nodded toward the equipment tent. His personal files are in there. Locked cabinet, but he pulled a small tool from his pocket. I might have accidentally borrowed the master key from site administration. They moved quickly across the excavation area to shadows in the Mexico City night. The equipment tent was dark, smelling of canvas and machine oil and old paper. Marco's lockpick made almost no sound, just a quiet click as the cabinet opened. Inside were 3 decades of field notebooks, dating back to Vasquez's first excavations as a graduate student. Elena started with the most recent ones, looking for references to artifact storage. She found them in a notebook from 18 months ago. A list of pieces, each with original grid coordinates and discovery dates. Obsidian blades from 4 different sites across central Mexico. All ritual knives. All authentic pre-Columbian artifacts, and all carefully documented in their original contexts before Vasquez had removed them from official records. He kept the data. She breathed. All of it. Every original provenance, every field photograph, every measurement.
Why would he do that? Marco asked.
Because he's still an archaeologist. Underneath the fraud, underneath the desperation, he still cares about the science. Elena photographed each page with her phone, making sure the images were sharp and readable. These artifacts are valuable data. They tell us about ritual practices, trade networks, cultural exchange. The science is real even if the context he created is false. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I know you're at the site. We need to talk. Elena's blood went cold. She looked at Marco, who'd gone pale. They both knew who the message was from. She typed back, "How did you know?" The response came immediately. The security system sends alerts when cameras go offline. I'm at the pit. Come alone, or I delete everything.
Don't go. We call the commission right now. Let them handle this.
If he deletes his documentation, we lose all the original provenance data. Every artifact becomes worthless for research. Years of legitimate discoveries erased.
It's not worth the risk.
It's worth exactly the risk. She pulled free. Keep photographing those notebooks. If something happens, you have everything you need to report this properly. The walk across the excavation area to the pit felt like it took hours. In reality, maybe 30 seconds. Vasquez stood at the edge, his silhouette backlit by a lantern he'd placed on the ground. In his hands, he held a laptop. His personal laptop, the one that probably contained digital records of every artifact he'd ever excavated.
You always were the most thorough student I had, he said as Elena approached. His voice was tired, not angry. I knew you'd figure it out eventually.
The jade bead was real. Elena stopped a few feet away, hands visible, non-threatening. All 13 obsidian blades are real. V found them legitimately over years of excavation.
They were supposed to stay lost. Vasquez set the laptop on the ground, carefully, like it was fragile. Each piece, sitting in storage somewhere, unremarkable alone. A jade bead without context. Ritual knives from common deposits. Nothing significant enough to publish. Nothing that proved my theory.
So you gave them context.
I gave them the context they deserved. His face hardened. 30 years I've been arguing that the Aztecs deliberately incorporated Toltec elements into Templo Mayor's foundation. 30 years of circumstantial evidence, architectural analysis, artistic parallels. Do you know how many times I've been told I'm projecting modern interpretations onto ancient cultures? How many grants I've lost because reviewers thought my theory was too speculative.
You don't prove a theory by manufacturing evidence.
I didn't manufacture anything. Those artifacts exist. The cultural connection exists. I just arranged the truth in a way that people would finally accept it.
That's not how science works.
Science works however the funding allows it to work. Vasquez's hand moved to the laptop. The museum board approved 3 more seasons. $5 million in funding. Enough to properly excavate the entire temple platform to find the real evidence that I know is down there. This cache was supposed to be the proof of concept, a justification to dig deeper.
And when you didn't find more evidence, when the deeper excavation showed your theory was wrong,
It's not wrong, his voice cracked. I've spent my entire life on this. I know I'm right. I just needed time to prove it properly.
Elena took a step closer. The laptop was open, showing a file directory. Hundreds of documents. Thousands of photographs. Decades of data that could salvage legitimate science from this disaster, or disappear with one keystroke. You kept the original documentation. She said every artifact's real provenance, every field note, every measurement. That data is valuable. It proves you were doing real archaeology before you crossed the line.
Before I got desperate, you mean? Vasquez laughed, bitter. You know what the worst part is? 2 of those obsidian blades came from a site we worked together. Your first excavation season, remember? We found them in a ritual deposit, perfectly preserved. You were so excited, but the context was ordinary. Common votive offering, nothing publishable. So they went into storage.
Elena remembered she'd been 26, fresh from graduate school, thrilled to be working under Vasquez. Those blades had been beautiful, the obsidian napping some of the finest she'd ever seen. But Vasquez was right. The context had been unremarkable. Just another offering pit among thousands.
Those blades deserve better than storage, Vasquez continued. They deserve to be part of something important, to contribute to understanding, not gathered dust in a museum basement.
They contributed to understanding by showing us what ordinary ritual practices looked like. That's important too.
Nobody publishes ordinary. His hand hovered over the laptop keyboard. Nobody funds ordinary. Nobody remembers ordinary.
The jade bead doesn't make the lie true. Elena said the words quietly, but they hit Vasquez like she'd shouted them. His hand dropped. For a long moment, he just stood there, silhouetted against the lantern light. A man who'd devoted his life to held out the laptop. The password is Tula 1987. I was going to be remembered as the one who proved the Toltec connection. Instead, I'll be remembered as a fraud. He walked away, disappearing into darkness. The question wasn't whether to report this, but whether truth was worth the cost. The answer had to be yes. 3 months later, I stood in the museum's authentication vault. My new ID reading interim director. The obsidian blade sat behind glass. Just volcanic glass. Now, the jade bead occupied its own case, his name still on the placard. The commission decided authentic discoveries deserved proper attribution. My thumb had healed into a scar, a reminder that sometimes the past cuts back.